There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store.
And then the brothers, they tell Joseph that there's 12 sons, and that the younger is with their father, and one is no more. And Joseph, he must have twinged again, knowing that they're speaking about him. And he's right there in front of them. But is that really what they believed? Is that what they've been telling themselves these 20 years, that he's dead? And so now Joseph, he calls them spies again. You know, and you think about James Bond type spies. Well, these guys were nothing like James Bond. They had no cool gadgets. They had no sunglasses. But Joseph, he says he's going to test their honesty. And this is his original test. Okay, you're all going to prison, and only one of you will go back and get the youngest brother. None of you will get out of that prison until he comes down. This will prove that you're not spies, and this is your chance to prove that you're honest men. And so Joseph, he puts them all in prison. And you might kind of think that Joseph is trying to pay them back a little bit for all those years he spent in prison. But the difference is that Joseph, he was put into a real prison. And the word used here is not a prison like what Joseph experienced. The word here means custody, like he's being placed under house arrest, that he's going to be confined under a guard. But these guys, they needed those 3 days just to be able to examine themselves. Because it was only after those 3 days where they came to the conclusion that God was dealing with them because of their sin against Joseph. And now they're believing that they're reaping the fruit of their sin, and that God is beginning to give them what's coming to them for what they did to Joseph. And so Joseph, he comes back to them after the 3 days, and he says, do this and live. And he tells those brothers that he fears God, and that must have been a great relief to those brothers. And then Joseph gives them a new test to prove that they're honest men. And so he changes the test, and he says, well, only one of you will be kept, and the rest of you can take food back to your family. But then you need to bring your brother to me to verify your words. And then the brothers, they start talking to each other in front of him, and they're speaking in Hebrew because they don't think he can understand them. And then they start confessing their sins, and they start admitting their guilt. And for the first time, Joseph, he hears this confession. And all of them, they admit it. They admit that they saw the anguish in their brother. They saw him pleading, and they just ignored him. But even admitting and confessing, they still haven't repented. They've only confessed their sin. They haven't turned toward God, and they haven't asked forgiveness. And so you might wonder, well, why did Joseph pick Simeon to take into custody? Well, the reason I think he picked Simeon is because Joseph now hears this confession, and he realizes that Reuben really wasn't part of the betrayal. And although Reuben was too late, that Reuben actually wanted to save him. And Joseph didn't know that. He had just heard this for the first time. And Simeon, he's the second oldest. So Joseph, he gives Reuben a break. But see, Reuben is still guilty because he's still guilty of that cover-up with the father and then with the lies. But up until now, Joseph thought they all hated him. You have to also remember that Simeon, he was a very violent man, and he may have been the instigator of the whole betrayal with Joseph. But before Joseph binds Simeon in front of them, he turns around from his brothers and he weeps. And this is the first of 6 times that Joseph weeps. And you have to remember, see, Joseph here, he was the victim of a violent crime. And it's already been about 20 years since their conspiracy of murder and kidnapping. And he's already dealt with the pain of that betrayal years ago. And Joseph, he found a way to go on and not to be able to hold the sin against them and not to hate them in his heart. But the sin in the heart of the brothers, it hasn't been dealt with at all. And you'll often hear people tell you, they'll say, well, time, it heals all. Well, time does not forgive sin. And people, they may try to push it down in their hearts so they'll be able to function, but there's a real great price to pay for unrepented sin. And I always feel sorry for the men and for the women who've consented to having abortions and having to push that guilt down for years and years just to be able to function, where they've had to change their character and they have to harden themselves and they've had to reason with themselves as to why it occurred, or they always have to continually justify it to themselves that was their only option. And I don't believe that time heals these types of wounds. I believe they're just buried under a thick scar and a seared conscience, where the innocence of these people have been lost for years, and that they had to become a different type of person, a hardened person. And for these brothers and all their guilt, even after all these years of pushing it down, well, it only took 3 days for all that guilt to come rushing back. This is after 20 years. And for the victim, for Joseph, and his memory of his pain, well, it came flooding back in just moments as if it had just occurred. And the world will tell you, well, you need to forgive yourself. And that's as if you have the power to release yourself from your guilt and from the penalty of your sin, and that power is in yourself. And they'll tell you that that's the only forgiveness that you need, but it's not. You need to have God's forgiveness. And the only way that you can receive God's forgiveness is by turning toward God and confessing your sin. And it's just like it is here in this story. For reconciliation to occur, the first step has to be the confession of the sin. And now that they've done that, for the reconciliation to be completed, they also need to ask for forgiveness. And this doesn't just apply to sins like abortion, but it's any sin against God where you've lost your innocence, where you can't escape your guilt. It could be a theft. It could be drugs. It could be anything. But you see here that with Joseph, even after all this, he still loves his brothers because he cares for their families, no matter how harshly he spoke to them. And even though his brothers are not even aware of anything going on and what he's doing now and in his harsh treatment, he's not doing that for himself. He's doing it for them. He's doing it for their good. His motivation for being strong is for them. It's not for himself. And that's how it is with us. Sometimes we need to act strong for others. Sometimes we have to act tough for our children. And it's not that there's anything in us that wants to be tough, but they need us to be strong. They don't need just another buddy. But we can see Joseph's love for his brothers because Joseph, he's providing food for them and for their families. And he's actually doing it at no cost to them. Because the thing is, Joseph knows that they need food because he knows that they're starving, because the whole world is starving. But Joseph also knows that for the reconciliation, it's going to take time and that they're going to have to come back to Egypt. But that's okay because that famine is going to last a long time. And so now you got these 9 brothers and they're going back to Canaan and they have a new hope now because they figure, well, we're going to go back. We're going to go get Benjamin and then we'll come return and we're going to get Simeon. And we have enough food now and things are going to be all right. And that famine, well, that can end any day. But then when they stopped and they found money in their sack, it all changed. And then what they do is they blame God. And then when they get home, they found all that money in their sack and they say, oh, God's doing this to us. But Joseph is just using that money to prove their honesty. And they tell their father, Jacob, how harsh that man was and how he kept Simeon. And to get Simeon back now, they had to bring Benjamin down there. And Jacob makes it very clear, that's not going to happen. And then Reuben, he steps up and he's being the oldest, but he's lost that place of respect in his family. And he tells his father, he says, well, you can kill my 2 sons if I don't bring Benjamin back to you. And you tell me, what grandfather ever wants to kill his grandchildren for anything? So what kind of offer is that? And so they're sitting there and it's taking a long time. And it's a long time to return. And they probably waited there for up to a year. And it's just because Jacob was stubborn and he couldn't see God in any of this. And he cared more about that one son, Benjamin, than all the rest of them. And that must have been really hard on them. And he's already counted Simeon as being dead. And so they all had to sit around and they all had to wait until Jacob got hungry, until they were all starving again, until they had no other options. And Jacob said, oh, go buy us a little food. And then Judah, he steps up and he takes that occasion to rise to the position of leadership in that family. And he makes an offer to his father. And it wasn't like Reuben's offer, but he offered himself. He offered his own life. He didn't offer the life of his children. And Judah, he was adamant with his father that they can't buy anything without Benjamin coming with them. And now Jacob here, he's starting to sound like an old, feeble man that's a little bit out of touch with the world. And he's putting the blame on all of his troubles on everyone else. And he's trying to make his sons feel guilty, like it's all their fault. But then Judah, he reminds Jacob of what he said himself the first time when they went down to Egypt to get food. And he says, Dad, this is a matter of life and death. And so Jacob, he consents, but he doesn't stand up and he doesn't act in faith. He acts as if he's a defeatist. He's just basically given up. And he's now succumbing to the circumstances because he's really believing that they're all going to die. But he says, what can I do? And in his self-pity, he says, oh, I've lost Joseph. And he also counts Simeon as dead. And now I'm going to lose Benjamin. And Jacob, he can't see God anywhere, but God is everywhere in these circumstances. But Jacob can't see it. But God is saving them like he always has. He's always saved Jacob in all of his adventures. And it's amazing that Jacob never learns this. And he's always surprised when God steps in. And it's always at the point of disaster. But God has never let Jacob down. And so Jacob, he prepares a present for the Egyptian ruler, which is exactly the same thing Jacob did before he met Esau.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.